Hey guys, welcome to a roundup of low-profile graphics cards for the purpose of Windows XP retro gaming. So the idea is to pick up one of those cheap pre-built small form factor X business machines and turn it into a Windows XP retro gaming PC. We've got cheap cards like a GD610, but also high-end cards up to a GTX 750, and of course we've got Radeon cards like a 7470. And in this video we will have benchmarks, but I will also spend a bit of time on talking about each card in particular. Then we have a look at the performance of each card, and at the end I'll do my best to classify and group the cards together in terms of where they sit in the food chain, and also some general tips and recommendations. All these video cards have been benchmarked in a small form factor computer. That's what we're using. It's the HP Elite 8200. The specs are, we have got a Core i5 2400. We have 4 GB of Gddr5 memory in dual channel configuration and a 120 GB SSD, but everything else is stock. I've also added a drive bay. This just makes my life easier for benchmarking. So here's my SSD, but I can also attach a normal SATA hard drive for Steam games, for example. So it just gives me a little bit more flexibility, as well as adding 2 USB 3.0 ports. We will have a look at the cards and how they perform very shortly. Here are the benchmark settings. It's quite important to understand that we're running at very high resolutions, either 1920 by 1200 or 1600 by 1200. So if you're playing on a lower resolution monitor, you're gonna get a lot better performance. But I wanted to pick some demanding settings so we can see a bit of a spread between, especially between the faster video cards. So the first video card is the Nvidia Gt610. This is a model from Gigabyte. It is passively cooled. This is the only card that is passively cooled in our roundup today. We've got 48 shaders, we've got a gigabyte of RAM using Gddr5 memory and a 64-bit memory interface with around 10 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. Let's have a look at some benchmarks. Here we've got the 3D Mark benchmarks, 2001 SE, then 03 and then 05. And then let's move on to some games. So we can really see this is a 30 FPS card in Doom 3, X to the Threat, Far Cry, and then Half-Life 2, just over 30 FPS. And F.E.A.R and Crysis, these games are too demanding for this video card. Next up, we've got the GT630. This one is from Inno3D. We've got 96 shaders this time, also a gig of RAM, Gddr5 memory with a 128-bit interface, and 21.3 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. So if this sounds twice the capacity of what the 610 has, that's exactly right. And looking at the benchmarks, we can kind of see the result. It seems to be twice as fast as the GT610. Let's have a look at some games. So we can now see that in many games we get more than 60 FPS. So in Doom 3, X to the Threat, Far Cry, and Half-Life 2, this video card delivers playable performance. It's only in F.E.A.R and in Crysis that this video card might struggle a little bit. And this is the GT710, but with Gddr5 memory, so you gotta be a bit careful. Nvidia seems to have several versions of these cards. In general, if you pick the Gddr5 version, you should get a decent model. So here we've got 192 shaders. This one is made on the 28 nanometer process, so it runs cooler and quieter. We've got 2 GB of memory, so double than the previous cards. We've got Gddr5 with a 64-bit memory interface and a memory bandwidth of 40 gigabytes per second. So let's have a look. The specs sound impressive, but when you look at the benchmarks, it performs similar on the level as the 630. So let's have a look at some games and we can see the same trend. In Doom 3, it is ahead, but in X to the Threat and Far Cry is actually behind the 630. In Half-Life 2, it's even Steven pretty much. In F.E.A.R, it's a little bit in front, and in Crysis, it's on the same level as the 630. So same recommendation, decent card for most Windows XP games. You will get more than 60 FPS, but F.E.A.R and Crysis, they are a little bit too demanding. However, this card is less power demanding, quieter, and that might be something that you look out for. And here we have the GT730 with Gddr5 memory. This one is from Pallet, and not the cheapest card. I had to hunt the card down a little bit from overseas. It might be a little bit too new to be available secondhand, but if these cards become available secondhand, do keep an eye out for them. They have very good performance. So we have 384 shaders, so that's a lot more than the previous card. 2 GB of video memory, Gddr5. We still have a 64-bit memory interface, but because the effective memory clock speed is so high, we still get 40 GB per second of memory bandwidth. And here we've got the 3D Mark results, and we can already see that this card is on the next level up in terms of performance. And looking at the games, we're now getting 120 FPS performance in Doom 3, X to the Threat, and in Far Cry. In Half-Life 2, still around 100 FPS. And this is the first card now that is almost able to deliver 60 FPS in F.E.A.R. But do keep in mind that the resolution is fairly high, 1920 by 1200, and it's really only Crysis that is a bit too demanding for this card. But otherwise, pretty much any Windows XP game with highest settings and high resolution should run really smooth on this video card. And you will find a lot of workstation video cards in the low profile form factor, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of workstations are sold in the small form factor format, Quadros and Fire GL cards. So this is the Quadro 600, and if we look at the specs, we have 96 shaders, we've got a gigabyte of DDR3 memory, 128-bit interface with 25.6 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. If that sounds familiar, these are very similar specs to the GT630. The GT630 did have higher core clock, but the Quadro has faster memory. So let's have a look at the benchmarks, how that translates, and we can see that the Quadro 600 is pretty much on the level of the 630 and the 710 with Gddr5. And if we look at games, we can see the same thing. Now the Quadro cards are a little bit slower under OpenGL, so you can see that in Doom 3, where it's behind the other cards a little bit, but in all the other games it's pretty much on the same level. So if you see a cheap Quadro 600, just think of a GT630, it's roughly on the same level. And now we're on to the first Radeon card. This is the Radeon HD 4650. What stands out, this one is produced on the 55 nanometer process, so it consumes a bit more power and the temperatures might be a bit higher, and it's got a fairly more significant cooler than some of the other cards we're gonna have a look at. Also, with the drivers, AMD on the website have the driver 14.4, but they've got 3 packs. So it just says 14.4 Catalyst Pack 1, Pack 2, Pack 3, but it doesn't really tell you which pack is for which card. For this card, you need the Catalyst 14.4 Pack 1. Other specs of the card, we've got 320 shaders, a gigabyte of DDR2 memory, so there might be a DDR3 version out there. Have a look at the clock speeds. The memory runs fairly slow at only 800 megahertz effective memory clock speed, but it does have a 128-bit memory interface, and we're getting 12.8 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. So let's have a look at the 3D Mark results. So it's the green bar, so it's behind it's somewhere in between the 610 and the 630, kind of closer to the 610. So let's have a look at some games. We can see the same thing. It's in front of the 610 in most games, but it's behind the 630 and closer to the GeForce GT 610. And here we have the Radeon HD 7470, and this card seems to be an OEM model. It might come out of a HP or Dell machine. There's no description on it, but it's got these barcodes or QR codes, and if you just scan those, it finds some information and it will tell you the model number. But these are readily available on eBay. A lot of the e-cyclists pull these out of old workstation machines and sell them on eBay. So let's have a look at the specs. We've got 160 shaders for this card. Once again, a gig of Gddr3 memory, but only a 64-bit memory interface. So let's have a look at the performance. We can see in 3D Mark 2001 SE, so in front of the Radeon 4650, but in the other benchmarks, it's on par in 03 and a little bit behind in 05.
looking at games, we can see this card is ahead in Doom 3, in X2 and in F.E.A.R, but in Far Cry and Half-Life 2 it's actually behind the older 4650, which is very interesting, and in Crysis it's on the same level. So here we have the Radeon HD 8490, another one of these OEM video cards. I believe this one is from Dell. Again, you can just scan these codes here and you will find out what model it is. There's no other description on the card. Also interesting is that we're getting DVI and DisplayPort on these cards. So in terms of specifications, we've got 160 shaders, we've got a gigabyte of Gddr5, and the clocks are very similar to the last card we looked at. In terms of drivers, these ones use the driver pack 2 of the Catalyst 14.4 package. Looking at 3D Mark, it's just a little bit faster than the 7470 we looked at before, and in games, let's have a look, we can see the same thing. It's a little bit in front, but we can once again see a bit of a weakness in Far Cry and Half-Life 2 compared to the 4650, so that's really interesting. But in all the other games, this is ahead of the two other Radeon cards we just looked at. And here we have the Radeon HD 7570, once again an OEM card. It was advertised as a Dell video card, but with Gddr5, and that piqued my interest. The driver pack is 2 again, but the driver will fail to install. You have to just install it to unpack the driver, and then you need to manually install it through Device Manager. That's under Windows XP. Under Windows 10, for example, the drivers will work just fine. But under Windows XP, you need to manually install them through the Device Manager. So we've got 480 shaders, so that's a lot more. We've got a gigabyte of Gddr5 memory with 128-bit interface. And look at the bandwidth, 51.2 gigabytes per second. So that should be a lot faster than the other cards. And if we look at our benchmark results in 3D Mark, it's almost faster than the GT730 with Gddr5. At least in 2001 SE, it's faster. In the other two benchmarks, it's a little bit behind. And looking at the games, in Doom, basically in all the games, it's just a little bit behind the GT730 with Gddr5. So very decent performance. And yeah, if you happen to find one of these cards, definitely pick one up. Very good performance. Especially the high-end low-profile cards like the GTX 750, 750 Ti and the Radeon 7750, they are a little bit more expensive to obtain and some of them quite hard to find. And for those, I just use the normal desktop versions, and using a PCI riser card and a chopping board, I was able to just connect them to our low-profile computer. I put up some photos so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. And this is the Nvidia Gtx 750. This is a model from Gigabyte. We've got 512 shaders. We've got 1 gigabyte of Gddr5. And look at the memory bandwidth, 80.2 gigabytes per second. That's a lot. And if we look at the 3D Mark results, this is now the fastest card so far, especially in 03 and 05. We can really see how much faster this video card is. Looking at the games, and look at that, in Doom 3 over 240 FPS, in Half-Life 2 over 240, in X2 The Threat and Far Cry we're getting over 180. Even F.E.A.R 120 FPS, that's insane. And even Crysis almost 60 FPS. And remember, that's at 1920 by 1200 resolution. And this is the GTX 750 Ti, also from Gigabyte. It looks exactly the same like the other card, but the specs are different. We've got more shaders, 640. We also have double the VRAM, 2 gigabytes now. The memory clock is a little bit higher. We have 86.4 gigabytes per second. And looking at 3D Mark, not much changes in 2001 SE and in 03. It's a little bit faster than in non-TI. In 05, there's not much of a difference. And looking at the games, it's a little bit faster than the non-TI, but not much. And we also have a high-end representation from AMD. This is the Radeon HD 7750. There is a low-profile version of this card, but it's very hard to find. Nothing available in Australia, and the only way I
could get one if I wanted was a low profile card, but quite expensive, beyond $100 at least. So here we're dealing with 512 shaders. We've got Gddr5 running at an effective clock speed of 4000 megahertz, which gives us a nice memory bandwidth of 64 gigabytes per second. So let's have a look how this card stacks up. So that's the last bar, the green one. So we can see it's a little bit behind the GTX 750 cards, but not by a lot. Let's check out some games. So here we can see the same thing in Doom 3, X to the Threat. It's a little bit behind, but then in Far Cry and Half-Life 2 and then F.E.A.R, the gap does widen. So here the Nvidia cards are a lot stronger. And in Crysis, it's not able to reach 60 FPS, but you will definitely get more than 30 FPS. So what I'm going to do now is have a go at grouping these cards in terms of where they sit in the food chain. So here we have the high-end video cards. These are all produced on the 28nm process. So all these video cards are the latest and greatest, available from Nvidia and AMD, that are available in the low-profile form factor. The GeForce cards are faster, but the Radeon card is not far behind. And if you've got a 60 Hz monitor, all of these cards will have sufficient performance. With the Radeon cards, I will make a comment later about the drivers and the features. The AMD drivers are a little bit better for XP gaming. On the flip side, finding a 7750 low profile might be a bit tricky. The 7750 is quite interesting because it seems to be available as a single slot solution, whereas the 750 cards are usually dual slot. Now with the GTX 750 cards, unfortunately, if you type it into eBay, you will find so many fake video cards from China at the moment, so it's really hard to find the legit versions, but there used to be, like half a year ago, you were able to buy low-profile versions brand new in the shops, but they have disappeared. So it might be a little bit too early to find one second-hand, but you are more likely to find a used low-profile GTX 750 than you are a 7750, in my opinion, just from following eBay for quite a while. For mainstream gaming, I can recommend these two cards. That's the GD730 with Gddr5 memory and also the 7570 also with Gddr5 memory. Both have decent memory bandwidth and enough shaders to run pretty much any Windows XP game at high resolutions and with high settings. It's really only Crysis that is beyond what these video cards can do. But do keep in mind, all the benchmarks were done with high resolution monitors. So if you're using a 1280 by 1024 retro-friendly monitor, then you will get even more performance. So keep an eye out for these two video cards. In my opinion, they're the sweet spot. They're low power, single slot, and have really good performance. And these are what I consider the value low profile video cards. So we've got the GD710 with Gddr5, we've got the GD630 and the Quadro 600. They all perform roughly on the same level. Most games will run at 60 FPS plus on a high resolution monitor, even faster on a 1280 by 1024 monitor. Only F.E.A.R and Crysis, these games are quite demanding. In F.E.A.R, if you disable the soft shadows, then that game will also become playable on these cards. All of these are single slot, and all of these are a little bit older and should be a lot easier to find on eBay, especially the 630. Also keep an eye out for rebrands. For example, the 630, I believe there was a 430 as well, which is exactly the same chip basically. But all of these cards should be fairly cheap. The Quadro might cost a little bit more, so only go for the Quadro if the price is right, because consider that in OpenGL games it's a little bit behind of the other cards. But especially the 630 should be easy to find on eBay and not cost a lot. The 710 might be a little bit too new to be cheap, especially the Gddr5 version, which is the one that we used in our roundup. And here we have the budget video cards, the GD610, we've got the 4650, the 7470, and up here the 8490. And these are basically 30 FPS cards, that's how I see it.
Now that's on a high resolution monitor, but even if at 1280 by 1024, these cards are more suitable for older games, and maybe you have to dial down the details a little bit, but that's okay. Far Cry will run a lot better on high details compared to Ultra and still look fairly good. Now the 4650, this one should be really easy to find on eBay. It's quite a bit older. However, it is produced on the 55nm process, so it consumes more power and generates more heat. Also, the fan noise was the loudest out of all the cards. In general, all these cards are fairly quiet, and the fans of the low-profile computers are usually loud enough to drown out the fan noise. But you can get a passive card like the 610, for example. And keep in mind the price. So if you're looking, for example, at a 610, do have a look how much a 630 costs. A 610 has to cost half as much as a 630 in order to be better value. So do keep that in mind. Spending a little bit more can give you a lot better performance. With the Radeon cards, a little bit disappointed because they're all bunched together. There wasn't really anything in between these cards and the next model up. I was hoping for a bit more of a spread like we saw with the Nvidia cards. Yeah, they all kind of perform the same. So what can you do? Keep an eye out for the specs, the shaders, and especially the memory system. Anything with 64-bit or Gddr5 memory is usually quite slow. So just a few general tips when shopping around for low-profile video cards. Try to get the Gddr5 versions if there is a choice. They are usually a lot better. Also check that the low-profile and the full-height brackets are included. The Palette video card, for example, didn't include any low-profile brackets, and that was my fault. I didn't check carefully enough. If you're buying second-hand and there's nothing to be seen on the photo, reach out to the seller and ask them if they've got the low-profile bracket. If they don't, you should ask for a little bit of a discount, because without the brackets, it's a bit of a pain to use these graphics cards. A few other pointers. If you're deciding to go for an Nvidia video card, do be aware that a couple of driver features don't work. For example, the GPU scaling is not enabled, doesn't work in the latest drivers. Same goes for if you're using an HDMI output. The color space can't be set between limited and full RGB, as well as the custom resolution menu is also not functioning anymore. On the Radeon cards, this still works, so the drivers are actually more retro friendly. You've got GPU scaling, you can configure the HDMI color space between full RGB and limited RGB, and you can create custom resolutions. So there you have it, guys. That was a nice little roundup of low profile video cards from Nvidia, but also from AMD. And let me know what you think. Also any feedback and suggestions, maybe using a card not shown here. Tell us how you're finding it in your small form factor machine. And that's really it for this video. As always, guys, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more stuff like it, please subscribe, give it a like, and I shall see you soon with another one.